Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Ayman Nazir and welcome to Knowledge Realm. So students, we are studying International Relations Part 1 and we are studying the most important chapter of this subject. We are studying theories of international relations, and in the previous lecture we studied the most dominant theory of international relations. We studied realism, and in particular we studied classical realism. And we studied about that theory in detail. We studied the core assumptions of classical realism. We studied the worldviews of different ancient scholars such as Thucydides, such as Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. We studied about all these things in the previous lecture. Then we studied the history of realism also. So I hope that all of you have a very good idea of what realism is and what realism advocates. Now today, students, we're going to cover the second most dominant theory of international relations that the scholars of international relations use. I'm talking about liberalism. Liberalism is one of the most dominant theories of IR. We know that there are two dominant theories. One is realism and the second is liberalism. We have studied some part of realism. We have studied classical realism, and today we're going to study liberalism. So it's going to be very interesting. Just stay focused and let's get started. So starting with the brief introduction of liberalism. Well, I've already mentioned this in the previous slide that liberalism is one of the most dominant theories of IR. But who gave this theory, and when this theory was given, in which century this theory came into being, and who were the scholars behind this, and why this theory was proposed by the scholars. So, students, this theory, liberalism, is actually a philosophical product of Enlightenment era of Europe, and we all know that Enlightenment era was from 17th century to 18th century. This was the era when the philosophers of Europe, they started learning things. They started learning about the rule of monarchs and the Catholic and the democracy and all these things. This was the era, Enlightenment era, when these philosophers proposed such kind of things. So we call this era Enlightenment era because in this era philosophers were enlightened with all these philosophies, and they enlightened other people with these philosophies. They gave these philosophies, and the Europe was enlightened. So we call this era Enlightenment era. So liberalism is actually a philosophical product of this era, that is 17th century to 18th century. Prominent liberal scholars of history are John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu. These are the liberal scholars, and they gave their view, they gave their worldview, and they actually presented some ideas, and they presented some ways to maintain peace in the world, because we know that in the history there have been wars and conflicts and disturbance and many bad things in the world. So these scholars, they actually started thinking about all these evil things in the world, and they gave their philosophy, and their philosophy was called liberalism. Now, what does liberalism advocate? Liberalism advocates political freedom, democracy, constitutionally guaranteed rights, and privileged the liberty of the individual and equality before the law. These are actually the core assumptions of liberalism. These are the ideas of liberalism that liberal scholars gave. Liberal scholars say that there should be political freedom. They say that there should be democracy and constitutionally guaranteed rights. People should be given rights, and individuals should be given rights. Individuals should not be suppressed. Individuals should not be persecuted by the monarchs and the Catholic priests and all these peoples. And the rule of monarchs is not justified. This is not fair. There should be democracy and there should be political freedom. So these were all the ideas given by the liberal scholars such as John Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. Then liberalism promotes free trade and capitalism. We would study about this in the future, What is free trade and capitalism? Liberal scholars believe that there should be free trade and there should be capitalism. Nations should involve in trade and they should develop their relations by the help of free trade. Now, this is something that liberal scholars promote. Then, liberals believe in international law and international institutions. We all know that back in 16th century, 15th century, there was no international law and nations, they just used to fight, they just used to get involved in wars and there was no international law and there were no international institutions. So liberal scholars gave the idea of international law. Liberal scholars assert that there should be international law to prevent such kind of conflicts and to prevent such kind of wars, because war is nothing but the slaughter of common man, because we all know that in war who dies? It's the common man. Common men suffer in war. So liberal scholars actually talked about the rights of common man. They talked about the rights of people, they talked about the equality before the law, and they talked about the peace. Unlike realism, realism does not talk about anything like this. Realism is entirely 180 degree of this liberalism. Liberal scholars actually advocated peace. They gave ways and they gave ideas to maintain peace in the world. Then liberal scholars believe that liberal states do not wage war and they set a peaceful environment in the world. Now, these were the main ideas of liberal scholars, and it was a brief introduction of liberalism. Father of liberalism, John Locke. Students, it is believed that father of liberalism is John Locke. John Locke was the person who gave the theory of liberalism. He was born in 1632 and he died in 1704. He was the person who talked about liberalism for the first time. Now students, let's study what happened in his life and what was the thing that he witnessed during this time, 1632 to 1704. What was happening in society at the time that made him think about all these things, that made him think of new ways to maintain peace in the world. Well, John Locke actually witnessed glorious revolution of England in 1688. If any of you does not know about glorious revolution of England, you should study about this. John Locke was born in 1632 and he died in 1704. So he witnessed glorious revolution of England in 1688. What happened at that time? Well, we all know that this was the time when Protestants and Catholics were fighting in Europe. Protestants were saying that the Catholic Church and priests, their rule is not justified and there is no justification for their rule and their authority. Why they're ruling over people? There is no justification, there is no pretext for their rule. They should not rule on people. Protestants were actually trying to overthrow the authority of Catholic priests. On the other hand, the Catholic people, they wanted the authority of Catholic priests on them, and they believed that no, church should rule and there should be no segregation of a state, and church should rule. So there was a conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Then the Protestants started this glorious revolution of England in 1688, and this was the time when John Locke started thinking about all these things. Protestants overthrew King James II, and then King William took the throne. King James II, who was Catholic, he was overthrown by Protestants, and King William, he took the throne, he was actually Protestant. Now this thing made John Locke think about the authority of monarchs. John Locke denounced the authority of Catholic priests. He actually advocated the rights of human, and then he gave a concept of social contract between ruler and the ruled. Now what is this social contract? This is a very, very interesting concept given by John Locke. John Locke believed that government should exist with the consent of the governed. John Locke believed that there should be a contract between the ruled and the ruler. I mean, if the subjects want a ruler to rule, then the ruler should continue its rule. But if the subjects are not satisfied with the ruler, they do have the right to overthrow the ruler. And this is a thing that Protestants did in 1688, Glorious Revolution of England. They overthrew King James II because they were not satisfied with King James II and they did not want King James II to rule on them. So they overthrew the king, and this is the social contract of John Locke. John Locke believed that governments are there to provide some facilities to the people who they rule. And if the people are not satisfied with the government, people have the right to overthrow the government. This is the social contract between ruler and the ruled, and this concept was given by John Locke. Then John Locke believed that government should exist with the consent of the governed only. If the governed do not give the consensus on the government, government should be overthrown. Now this is the right of people. Now this is the liberal view of John Locke. Subjects have the right to rebel against the governments if the government failed to uphold its responsibilities. Now this was the view of the father of liberalism, John Locke. So we have studied that the father of liberalism is John Locke. John Locke was the person who gave this philosophy, who laid the foundation of liberalism. Now let's just study some core assumptions of the philosophy liberalism given by John Locke. In the previous slide, we studied the brief introduction of liberalism by John Locke. Now here we would study this concept, liberalism, and the assumptions of John Locke in detail. So first of all, the first assumption and the first idea of John Locke was about the perfect state of nature. John Locke believed that human is in perfect state of nature, that it does not need any monarch or king. John Locke criticized monarchy and arbitrary authority of kings. He did not like kings. He did not like monarchs. He believed that why these people are ruling on millions of people. Why? What is the justification? Who gave them this right? Just because they are king, just because they were born in the house of king, in the royal palace, they do have the right to rule over millions of people. What is the justification? This is not logical. So this was the concept of John Locke, and this was the base of liberalism, the philosophy that John Locke proposed. John Locke believed that there is nothing wrong with human is in perfect state of nature, and human does not need any monarch or king. Now this thing is in conflict with the view of Thomas Hobbes. If any of you remembers, we studied the concept of Thomas Hobbes, and Thomas Hobbes believed that the state of nature is not good for human. Human is in state of nature, and human is cunning, greedy, and selfish, and human kills other people. So this state of nature is not good, and we studied this. Thomas Hobbes actually lived in civil war. He lived in a time when Europe was engulfed in civil war, so he saw that there was no government, there was no authority of any monarch or king. So people what they were doing? They were fighting. And that was the state of nature of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes believed that human is not safe in state of nature, because in state of nature there is no one to protect human. There is no one to stop the cruel person, to stop the tyrant, and human, they are fighting and they are just killing each other. That was the concept of state of nature for Thomas Hobbes. But here John Locke, who is a liberal scholar, he believes that human is in perfect state of nature, and there is nothing wrong with this perfect state of nature, and human does not kill, and human does not need any monarch or king. Now this is the view of a liberal scholar. That was the view of a realist scholar. Thomas Hobbes was a realist scholar, and he believed that state of nature is not good for the well-being of human, because in state of nature people fight and they kill, and no one is safe, and all human are equal, and they kill and they fight and they do all this. So there's a difference between the state of nature. Just try to understand this, okay? I think I've explained this state of nature very well. So the first idea The first assumption of John Locke was about the perfect state of nature. John Locke believed that human is in perfect state of nature. It does not need any monarch or king, and he criticized monarchy and arbitrary authority of kings, and he believed that why these people are ruling over people. The monarchs and the king, they do not have any right to rule. Then the second idea given by John Locke was about social contract. He gave this social contract theory. Now, what is this social contract? We have studied this in the previous slide in detail. John Locke gave this theory, and he believed that rulers and ruled should make a contract for the peace of the society. Government should guarantee the rights of its subjects, and people in return of these rights should be loyal to their government and should obey the rules made by government. Now, this is the social contract. For example, the government of US, who is Joe Biden these days, Joe Biden would try to guarantee the rights of its people. And now, what are the rights of people? Life, liberty, property, safety, food, shelter, all these things. These are and peace also, peace in the society. Peace in the society, internal peace, external peace, and protection from the invaders, and protection of borders of USA, all these things. These are the things that Joe Biden should guarantee, because he is president. He should guarantee all these rights of its subjects. Now, what the people of USA would do in return, they would be loyal to Joe Biden, and they should obey the rules made by government. If government says that you are not allowed to steal, then people should obey. If government say that you are not allowed to, for tax evasion, you should not evade tax, then government should obey. People should obey. People should pay taxes. Now, this is the social contract. This was the concept given by John Locke. John Locke says that there should be a contract between ruler and rule, and this way, only this way, we can maintain peace in the society. Okay, now the third assumption of John Locke: government should guarantee life, liberty, and property. Now, this is actually a part of social contract. Just make a social contract between the ruler and the ruled. Now, what is the responsibility of government? It is guarantee life, liberty, and property. These are the rights of human, and government should guarantee these rights. Now, this is the responsibility of a government, and we all know that back in 16th century, in 15th century, the monarchs, they did not care about these things. All they cared was their power maximization, expansion of their empire, and this is what they used to do, and this is what realism advocates. This is what Thucydides advised, and this is what Niccolo Machiavelli advised. What were the advices of Niccolo Machiavelli? What did he say to the prince in the letter The Prince that we studied in the lecture of realism? Niccolo Machiavelli was saying that if you have to choose between love and fear, it is far better to be feared than loved. So this was the concept of realist scholars, that a prince should always be cunning, a prince should always be ready to deceive anyone, a prince should use the technique of deception. Now, why prince should do all these things? To maximize its power and to strengthen its rule and to strengthen its empire. So these were all the views of realist scholars, the Niccolo Machiavelli and the Thucydides. Now, what this liberal scholar is saying that government should think about its people. Government should guarantee life, liberty, and property. Now, this is completely 180-degree to what realist advised to the princes. Realists say that princes should only be interested in maximization of power and expansion of their empire. But this is not the concept in liberalism. Liberal scholars believed in the rights of human and life, liberty, and property. Now, the fourth idea given by John Locke: government should only exist by the consent of the governed. Now, this is the most important idea given by John Locke. John Locke believes that government should only exist by the consent of the governed. If the subjects are not happy with the government should renounce upon the throne. And this is what happened in Glorious Revolution of 1688. The people of England, they were not happy with their Catholic monarch, the King James II, so they overthrew the monarch, the King James II. And John Locke believes that this was fair and this was the right of the people. I mean, if the people are not happy and the government fails in earning the trust of the people, then government should renounce upon throne, government should be overthrown by the people. He believes that if governed are not satisfied, individuals have the right to overthrow the government. Now, this is the most important view of John Locke's liberalism. So I hope that I've explained everything in detail and all of you now understand what was the view of John Locke and what kind of liberalism John Locke presented. He was the father of liberalism, and he gave all these core assumptions and core ideas of liberalism. So we have studied the views and ideas of John Locke. Now we would study the core assumptions of liberalism. Now students, just don't get confused here and try to make distinction between these two things. In the previous slide, we studied the ideas of John Locke, the father of liberalism, how he viewed world and what were the ideas and philosophy given by John Locke. Here we would study the core assumptions of liberalism, which means that we would study the essence of liberalism. Here we would study the essence of all the philosophies given by all the liberal scholars such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu. Here we would study the essence of different views of all the scholars of liberalism. So first of all, let's see how liberal scholars view war. They say that wars are created by militaristic and undemocratic governments for their own vested interest. Wars are engineered by a warrior class bent on extending their power and wealth through territorial conquest. Then they say, wars provide governments with excuses to raise taxes, expand their bureaucratic apparatus, and increase their control over their citizens. Now, these three were the arguments on war by the liberal scholars. They are trying to prove the war an evil event. They're trying to say that war is unjustified, completely unjustified, and there is no reason for war, and the undemocratic governments go for war. And they're trying to say that the peaceful people and the subjects of these undemocratic governments would never go to war. And we studied in realism how realist scholars were trying to justify war. They were trying to say that the increase in the power of Athens led to the increase in the fear in Sparta. I don't remember the quote exactly, but Thucydides were trying to say that one rival is increasing its strength, and this thing is inculcating fear in its rival, and now this thing would lead to war. So war is inevitable. This was the belief of realist scholars, and John Mearsheimer, who is a realist scholar, he also used to say, he said that in the anarchic international world, it is better to be Godzilla than Bombay. He advocates that there is a mistrust in the world. There's a trust deficit, and you don't know who is your friend and who is your rival, and people would kill you, and people would try to maximize their power. So it's good to be Godzilla than Bombay, because no one likes to be killed and no one likes to be suppressed. So you should maximize your power only. Now, this was the view of realist scholars. They believed that there is a mistrust and all these things, there is anarchy, so we should increase our power and we should suppress other people so that we are we are preserved, because they believed in self-preservation, they believed in survival. So realist scholars believe that there should be power maximization. Now here, liberal scholars are saying that war is an evil event, and war is not justified, and wars are created by militaristic and undemocratic governments for their own vested interest. And these people, these undemocratic governments, they do not care about their people. Wars are engineered by a warrior class only, bent on extending their power and wealth through territorial conquest. Now here, they're just trying to say that the princess and the undemocratic governments and the kings and monarchs, they are just interested in expanding their empire and maximizing their power. So this is the view of liberal scholars on war. They are trying to say that war is always unjustified. Then let's see how liberal scholars view human nature. Liberal scholars believe that people are peace-loving and altruistic. They are plunged into the conflict only by the whims of their unrepresentative rulers. And if we try to recall, what was the view of realist scholars on human nature? It was selfish, cunning, greedy, and lust of power. This is how realist scholars view the human nature. Realist scholars believe that human is greedy, human is nasty, human is always selfish, and human always thinks about itself. This is the view of realist scholars. On the other hand, liberal scholars say that people are peace-loving, people are altruistic. No one wants disturbance of peace, no one wants war. Just the undemocratic governments and the kings and monarchs, they want war, and they want to expand their power, they want to expand their territory at the expense of these peace-loving people. Because who die in these war? Peace-loving people, the soldiers, and the soldiers are fighting just because at the behest of their undemocratic governments and undemocratic rulers. So this is the view of liberals. Then democratic peace theory. Democratic states are peaceful. Such states do not resolve their conflicts in a violent way. Liberal scholars believe that democratic states, they do not wage war and they resolve their conflicts peacefully. And they do not like war, and they are very unlikely to go to war. This is the democratic peace theory, that democracies are always peaceful. Then free trade. This is also a very interesting aspect and idea of liberalism. Free trade is actually a medicine for war. This is the belief of liberal scholars. They say that if nations are involved in free trade, they would never resort to war. Trade overcome the artificial barriers of a state. Free trade unite people because it benefits everyone. People involved in free trade do not like to disturb the peace because war causes loss to everyone. It expands the range of contacts and levels of understanding between the people of the world and encourage international friendship and understanding. For example, if China and US they are involved in trade. US and China, they do trade of billions of dollars. Now, these two states would never go to war. Why? Because they know that if they wage war on each other, they would face loss. Their trade would be blocked, and it would incur a loss to their economies. So, liberal scholars believe that just get involved in trade. Try to unite the nations by the help of free trade, because if people are united by trade, they would never go to war and they would never cause loss to anyone, because people do not want their loss and they would never want the block of this trade. So the scholars, liberal scholars believe that democracy and free trade, these two things are a medicine for war. They say that this problem, this disease of war can be cured by the twin medicine of democracy and free trade. So these all were the core assumptions of liberal scholars. So students, today we have studied a lot about liberalism. We studied that who proposed liberalism and in which century it was proposed and what was happening at the time in the world, what was the situation of society, what was the situation of Europe at the time. We studied about the father of liberalism, John Locke. We studied his views, his social contract, and how governments should rule people with their consent, and how people have the right to overthrow the government. We studied all this. Then we studied the core assumptions of liberalism also. Then students, in 20th century, this philosophy of liberalism got divided into two. Today we study two types of liberalism. First, there is idealism, and then there is new liberalism. Now, what is idealism and what is neoliberalism? These are two new concepts. I mean, these concepts are based on the liberalism, the theory, the main theory that we studied today in detail. These two concepts, idealism and liberalism, new liberalism, these two theories are based on this liberalism, the main theory presented by the scholars in 17th and 18th century. But we would not study this today because today we have studied a lot. Inshallah, in the next lecture we would study idealism in detail, and we would study who gave this idea and what was happening at the time in the world, and what were the reason behind the proposal and invention of this idea, idealism. So thank you so much for today, and Allah Hafiz, and don't forget to like this video, don't forget to comment on this video, and don't forget to subscribe the channel Knowledge Run. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.